The last topic that we're going to cover is special tricks and shortcuts that can be used when calculating percentages by hand. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how we calculate 1% and 10%. So we know that 1% is the fraction 1 over 100. So in other words, if we're calculating 1%, we are simply dividing the value by 100 or moving the decimal 2 places to the left. Similarly, when we're finding 10%, 10% as a fraction we know is 1/10. In other words, when you find 10%, you can simply divide the value by 10 or move the decimal 1 place to the left. Let's look at a couple examples. This first example, we're asked to find 1% of 160. So if we take a look at where the decimal starts, in this case, it's going to come right after the 0. We know that 1%, we want to divide by 100 or move the decimal 2 places to the left, which means that 1% of 160 is 1.6. Let's take a look at another example. So in this example, it's very similar to the one we just did, except we're finding 10% of 160. So what we want to do again is we start with our decimal, and we know the decimal comes after the 0 in 160. With 10%, we're dividing by 10, or moving the decimal 1 place to the left. So it's going to come right between the 6 and the 0. So it'll be 16.0, which since 0.0 does not actually add any value, we can just write that as 16. The next thing we're going to talk about is how we calculate percents that are multiples of 100. So we know that 100% represents the whole amount. So then 200%, since 200 is twice 100, then 200% is 2 times the original amount. Similarly, 300% is 3 times the original amount, and so on. So in general, we say that any multiple of 100% represents that multiple value times the original amount. Let's look at a couple examples. So example 1, we want to find 400% of 7. So we want to figure out, okay, what multiple of 100% is 400%? Well, we know that to get 400, you would multiply 100 times 4, right? So 400% means we're multiplying the value by 4. So to find 400% of 7, we calculate 4 times 7, which of course is 28. Take a look at one more example. In example 2, we're asked to find 1000% of 8. Well, we know that 1000 is equal to 10 times 100. So 1000% is 10 times 100%. So to find 1000% of 8, we multiply 10 times 8. And 10 times 8 gives us 80. So 1000% of 8 is equal to 80. All right, now we're going to talk about how we calculate unusual percent values using a shortcut. So when we calculate percentages, we can save time by rewriting the percent value as a sum of multiples of 100, multiples of 10, and multiples of 1. Then we can use the shortcuts we discussed previously for calculating 100%, 10%, and 1%. Let's look at a couple examples of how we do this. So for this first example, we want to calculate 24% of 180. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take 24% and we want to split that up into 20% plus 4%. We can then take that one step further by rewriting 20% as 2 times 10% and 4% as 4 times 1%. So this is what we mean when we say rewrite the percentage as a sum of multiples of 10% and 1%. Next thing we want to do is we want to calculate 10% and 1% of 180. So off to the side, 10% of 180. We know the shortcut for this is moving the decimal one place to the left, so that's going to equal 18. 1% of 180, the shortcut here is moving the decimal two places to the left, so that's going to become 1.8. So now what we want to do is we want to substitute our 10% value and our 1% value in for 10% and 1% in our expression. So we have 2 times 10% value is 18, and 4 times our 1% value is 1.8. Two times 18 is 36. 4 times 1.8, we can do some scratch work for that. So 4 times 8 is 32, carry the 3. 1 times 4 is 4, add 3, 7. So that'll be 7.2. 36 plus 7.2 is 43.2. So this means that 24% of 180 is 43.2. Let's look at one more example. So here we want to calculate 135% of 40. So again, just like we did in the previous example, we want to break up that 135%. We can write that as 100% plus 30% plus 5%. 100% is one multiple of 100%. 30% is 3 multiples of 10%. And 5% is 5 multiples of 1%. So now that we have rewritten 135% as a sum of multiples of 100, 10, and 1%, we can calculate 100, 10, and 1% of 40. We'll start with 100%. So 100% of 40, well, 100% just refers to the whole amount. So 100% of 40 is 40. 10% of 40 is 4. And 1% of 40 is 0.4. And again, that's using the 10% and 1% shortcuts that we talked about earlier. So then we're going to take 40, 4, and 0.4 and substitute those in for 100%, 10%, and 1% in our expression. So we now have 1 times 40 plus 3 times 4 plus 5 times 0.4. 1 times 40 is 40. 3 times 4 is 12. And 5 times 0.4 is 2. 40 plus 12 plus 2 is 54. And so that is our final answer. We can say that 135% of 40 is equal to 54. All right, so we have one last shortcut to talk about, and that is calculating high percent values. So computationally speaking, it is typically much easier to calculate low percentage values compared to high percentage values. Because of this, when we calculate a high percent value, it can be easier to find the difference between the given percent and 100, and then calculate that percent, and then subtract that from the overall original value. So for example, if we want to calculate 98% of a certain value, instead we can calculate 2% and then subtract that from the original value. Let's take a look at a couple examples. So this first example, we want to calculate 98% of 450. So the difference between 100% and 98% of course, is 2%. And so what we need to do is we need to calculate 2% of 450 and then subtract that from 450. So we have 450 minus 2% of 450. So that is what we need to calculate. To calculate 2% of 450, so a shortcut we can use is, we know that 2% is 2 times 1%. So if we calculate 1% of 450, we can just multiply that by 2. 1% of 450, we can use our shortcut where we move the decimal 2 places to the left. So that's going to become 4.5. So we have 2 times 4.5, which is 9. So 2% of 450 is 9. Now all we need to do is subtract that from 450. 450 minus 9 is 441. So 98% of 450 is equal to 441. Let's look at one more example. So here we want to find 96% of 325. So again, we want to start by finding the difference between 96% and 100%, and that is 4%. So because there is a 4% difference, the shortcut here is to calculate 4% of 325 and then subtract that from 325. So 325 minus 4% of 325. And we can use that same shortcut we did in the previous example where we say, okay, 4%, that is 4 times 1%. 1% of 325, if we move the decimal 2 places to the left, that's 3.25. So we're looking at 4 times 3.25. And if you don't know that one off the top of your head, that's okay, because you can do a little bit of scratch work. So 4 times 3.25. 4 times 5 is 20, carry the 2. 4 times 2 is 8, add the 2, that's 10, carry the 1. 4 times 3 is 12, add 1, that's 13. So we get 13 even. So 4% of 325 is equal to 13. Now all that's left to do is subtract that from 325. 325 minus 13 is equal to 312. So this means that 96% of 325 is equal to 312.